And now, at this time, knowing all these things, how are we to react? How should we live? How should we serve and love one another in the church? Looking forward to Christ's return, Paul tells us that Christ's design for his church is that we grow in him who is our head. And in verse 16, having reaffirmed Christ's headship, Paul alludes again to Christ's provision for his church. He equips his body to be what he has called her to be, into what our responsibility then is. From him, Christ, the whole body being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies. This is where we come in. According to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. Yeah. You see, we all have a role. That's what Paul's telling us. It's the reason that we call this why every believer must be part of a local church. You cannot obey what we are called to here in verse 16 without being part of a local church. Paul's focus here, again, is on the growth of the body as a whole. It's been that way for 16 verses. And it's also on the need for each individual part to contribute to the growth of the whole body, that it may become mature in Christ. Subject hasn't changed really from the very beginning of this chapter. And it's the risen and ascended Christ who is equipped and continues to equip the body to grow through the contributions of every member. That's what he's saying here. The emphasis here is on Christ carefully fitting the members of the body together into a unified body that can grow together. There's no accident here. There's no accident in the church. Christ has brought us together. We in the body aren't some haphazard accident. The body's been fitted together by Christ, and it's held together by what every joint supplies. He laid the foundation. He's the cornerstone. He gifted us. And now we're called to each supply what he's given us. The growth of the body, Paul says, is accomplished by what every joint, what every supporting connection contributes. God designed his church this way. Now, Paul sometimes uses the human body as an illustration of the church, and it's really a good one. Other times he speaks of the church as a building or as the bride of Christ. But notice, here he again alludes to the picture of the human body, specifically the joints of the human body. Think of the farmer. He needs all his body parts to be working in order to plant and harvest a successful crop. What happens if the farmer's leg is broken? His planting, harvesting, feeding is going to be interrupted. He can't do the things he must do if he can't see. His eyes, he goes blind. He can't do the things he needs to do to bring forth a crop. He needs all his body parts to function and contribute. That's why this is such a great illustration, the human body. The lungs, if they're not functioning properly, if one's veins or arteries are damaged, the body is not going to function as it should. Think of a car. Car's a pretty good illustration. Many of the parts don't function properly. Car won't run properly, if at all. I mean, take away the carburetor. Take away a couple of spark plugs. Take away the battery. Take a tire. Take a part of the engine or the transmission. The car will not function. The church has a designer, and it's Christ. And he has designed his church so that all the parts must work together. And if all those, Paul is saying here, in the church are not supplying to the body that which Christ has gifted them to supply, and sometimes it's just encouragement of one another. It doesn't have to be some major thing, or even noticed so much by others. But we can all be encouragers of one another. But, again, if everyone isn't supplying that which Christ has gifted us to supply, the body is not going to grow as it should, at its optimum. If only 25% supply what Christ has gifted them to supply, the growth of the body is not going to be the same as if 100% are supplying what Christ has gifted them to supply. You take away even 10% of the possible, of the potential, and the body will not grow as it should. It is the proper working of each individual part that causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. That's what Paul says. So the use by all the members of their gifts is necessary, essential for the unity of the body and for the growth of the church. Harold Hoehner said this, wrote this, "In a sense, we are all blood vessels, respiratory passages of the body." And Paul is speaking of a flowing of benefit by the use of the gifts of all throughout the body, all contributing to its unity and growth. He continues, "Each and every contact within the body gives rise to the unity and growth of the whole body, just as every cell in the human body is dependent on the life of the rest of the body for its life." Harold Hoehner. So the message which Paul is conveying to us here and in the parallel companion letter of Colossians is this: Christ is the source of the growth of his church. At the same time, just as the human body, also created through the word of Christ, as the human body functions properly and experiences normal growth when all its parts, all its systems are functioning properly, so also the church. When each of its members supports and maintains loving contact with the others and with Christ, it will grow, ultimately to be a reflection of Christ, the head. Now, for those who would separate themselves from Christ's body, his church, I ask this, and I think Paul is posing this question to us here. How will you contribute that which Christ has given you if you separate yourself from his church? If you remain apart from, outside of a local church body? How will you supply what Christ has given you that is necessary to the growth of others and of the body if you remain apart from that body? This COVID thing brought about a whole generation now of people who think they're attending church by watching YouTube sermons. Paul's not talking about YouTube sermons. He's not talking about separate, individual church going. He says you can't contribute what God has gifted you with if you're apart from the body. We are called to be part of a local church so that we can supply what we've been gifted to supply. And in a sense, this is a call back to the people who've gone home and decided to go to church in their pajamas with a flat screen or a laptop. To remain outside the body, the church of Christ, and apart from his body, is to refuse to contribute that which God has gifted you to his body. It is to live in disobedience to him. The body gathers together. The church is an assembly. The word ecclesia means assembly, congregation, gathering. To refuse to contribute what God has given you is to refuse to help the body to grow as Christ desires. It is to refuse to contribute to the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. This is a God-given mission to every believer. Calvin again, the man is mistaken who desires his own separate growth. Those who neglect or despise this order choose to be wiser than Christ. Woe to the pride of such men. John Calvin.